Vernon, and I think I will ask each of them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what your role is at George Washington's Mount Vernon, starting with Allison on my immediate right.
Hello, I'm Allison Brashears, and I am one of the Historic Preservation Carpenters at Mount Vernon.
I'm Tom Reinhart. I'm the Director of Preservation.
I'm Amy McAuley, the Preservation Joiner and Restoration Manager.
I'm Martin Dougherty. I am an intern at Mount Vernon.
All right, well, as you heard from my preamble about the 4th of July, I'm interested in history. So I'd like to hear a little bit about maybe the origins of George Washington's Mount Vernon, and especially its focus on historic preservation. So Tom,
Sure.
maybe.
So Mount Vernon, as I think most of you will know, is the home of George Washington. It was constructed for his father in 1734 as a smaller house and expanded over time, principally by Washington and through his efforts. Washington lived there until 1799, the year that he died. And then it passed down through the Washington family for a few generations, and it was a site of pilgrimage and visitation. And the family was hard-pressed to keep up the house because there were so many people kept coming and coming. And eventually they wanted to divest themselves of it. So they offered it to the federal government, and the federal government had no infrastructure in place, no park service, no Department of the Interior, no historic parks, nothing. They didn't want anything to do with it. They also offered it to the Commonwealth of Virginia, same situation. And it was only through the actions of a woman by the name of Anne Pamela Cunningham, who founded an organization called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, that she founded it in 1853 with the sole purpose of raising the money to purchase Washington's home and to preserve it for the United States. And so to this day, the estate is owned by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. We are not a government. We have no affiliation with the government. We accept no public funding from the state, local, or federal governments. Everything we do is funded by people like you who come and visit and pay our entrance fee or donate very generously to support the work of the association. So thank you all for any help that you've ever given us. We are in the process right now of working on the largest historic preservation project in the history of Mount Vernon, which involves replacing and reconstituting part of the original 18th century wooden frame of the house that had been altered over time through deterioration and termite infestation and attempts at mitigating that damage. So what we came to in 2017 is that the house's frame is somewhat compromised, and we get 1 million visitors a year all going through the house. So we were very concerned that the house be stabilized and be put together in a way that it will make it last for the next 250 years. So when we celebrate the 500th of the United States, that your descendants will still be able to come and visit. So we are eyeball deep in that project, literally, and the house is open, but there are some rooms that are closed because of the work that we're doing. But you can actually see that work right now in parts of the house. There are no floors, no floor framing. You can look straight down into the cellar, which is pretty a unique experience, and it's the only time that you're ever going to get to do that. So I do recommend you get out sometime before the fall to see that, to experience the house that way. So there you have it.
Okay. Well, it sounds like George Washington's Mount Vernon was a true pioneer in this field of historic preservation. Can you maybe talk more about why it came about at that particular time? Or maybe it was just coincidental, but were there larger currents about preserving rather than tearing? Not that they were ever going to tear down, or maybe they did consider.
Not that we're aware.
Yeah.
But certainly there were places, Paul Revere's house, that got torn down. The houses of the founders were kind of reaching the end of their normal life, right? 100 years, 60 years, things like that. And they were starting to show their age, and in some cases they were being torn down. And Americans responded very viscerally to this. Similar trends were happening in Europe, where landmarks that people thought were always going to be visible and be a symbol of those cultures were starting to be taken down. So here in the United States, it was a time of great political turmoil in the 1850s, and Americans were looking back to the founding era to see the direction that the founders wanted us to go. And so they were beginning to open their eyes to the fact that the material culture of that time was disappearing. And so there began a movement within American society to preserve and protect those resources. And Mount Vernon was the first organization dedicated to solely preserving an American historic landmark. And it was done at a time when the nation was about to be torn apart by civil war. And it remained during the Civil War a place that was neutral. It was open to both Confederates and Union troops equally, principally because of the proximity to Washington, D.C. Mainly we had federal visitors rather than Confederate visitors, but certainly Robert E. Lee was married to Martha Washington's great-granddaughter, and he had a very close familial connection to the house.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So our topic is preserving George Washington's Mount Vernon for future generations. So I'd like to maybe turn to Martin, Amy, and Allison to hear more about the exact work that you are doing to preserving the building, which I'm sure, facing many challenges, partly due to its age, but partly that it's, it's an active tourist site. So Allison, maybe you can talk about some of the work that you're doing specifically and the challenges that you are facing in terms of maintaining or preserving and maintaining authenticity.
Right. So as Tom said, so there was deterioration that happened about 100 years ago. In order to mitigate that, a lot of the sills in the mansion were pulled out and kind of masonry was put in its place. And in order for that to happen, you have joists that tie into those sills, you have studs that also tie into those sills. So when you're pulling out the studs, you kind of have to hack away at the joinery there. And that's crucial to connecting the house together as a unit. So when we're going back through and we are reestablishing these sills, we are extending again the studs into the sills and the joists into the sills, which means, we have to pull up flooring, some of which has never come up before. Which that is always very daunting because some of the flooring has original dowels in them, and we have to strategically figure out which ones we can save and which ones have to be kind of sacrificed in a sense. So I think my favorite part of the process is being able to recreate the craftsmanship from the time that it was built, because that's where we usually start, is we're looking at the marks that were left behind by these craftspeople, because that's a lot of times all we have left. So we look at these marks, we do some studies, we figure out what kind of tools they were using, and usually start at that point, and we will pull out the axes that match the tool markings in the cellar, and we will be hewing away at this log, and then naturally we get to a point and we're well, we've been doing this for a day, we're all sweaty and hot, is there a faster way to get most of this done and then come back through with this axe again and finish the process? So it's been really rewarding to see what happened when the house was built as far as the craftsmanship marks, and then be able to recreate that and see where those craftspeople shined and triumphed and where they might have messed up and fix something along the way and be part of that history.
Yeah, and when you say the marks left behind, the
Yes.
preservation marks, and these are literally kind of where their tool intersected with the material.
Precisely, yes. And you get something like marriage marks as well, which is a shining star for us, because however they did the marriage marks, you can see they had a 2-inch wide chisel, and it's they you can see that happened, or they have a gouge, and you're that's really unconventional. Why are you using a gouge for that? But it's that's what they had at the time. So
Yeah. Is there ever kind of this moment where you think, oh my gosh, these people were so skilled, and how can I ever
yes,
match
absolutely. Yeah. When it came to hewing specifically, we were looking at those hew marks on the beams, and then have a 9-inch wide beam, and so you can see that they took a stroke here, a stroke here, a stroke here, and you're wow, okay, yep, that seems manageable. And then you go to do that work, and you're you're chopping away at it, and you're doing you're leaving 4 times as many marks on the wood just to get through it, and you're Well, I mean, that's how it is for me. So, but yeah.
Yeah, Martin or Amy, what are your experiences in terms of your kind of day-to-day work in terms of preservation carpentry or preservation joining?
For me, being an intern, I get to watch, and these great people get to show me how it's actually done in the right and proper way, so that we're not recreating these mistakes that happened 100 years ago. I was able to reproduce a bit of siding that goes on the southeast face of the building, and getting to do it the proper way using hand planes and chiseling out the chiquitas that we call them, and getting to create that faux stone look with wood is an experience that I don't think you would really be able to get anywhere else.
Amy?
Like I said the other day, the building is the master. None of us are the masters. I'm constantly learning. The building will tell us how to do it by looking at the marks, by understanding how it's put together. And then we can extrapolate, okay, this is how they did it. Can we do that? How do we do that? And sometimes, our mistakes are our greatest teachers. And, through trial and error, which is how I learned my trade, you learn how the former carpenters did it. And probably one of the first steps with each project is to go through and do very careful analysis. What are we doing? What does the old timber look like? What's our plan of action? And teaching these traditional trades is very important for our department. It's very important to me personally. When you're creating something with these tools, not only are you keeping a product that's in character with your historic house, you're keeping a dying craft alive, and that passing on to Martin is very important. And I'll say that we are what they grow beyond. And that is the best thing for a mentor / master, is to see your pupil advance beyond you.
Yeah, I really like that idea of the building being the master, and you are mentors who help maintain, preserve the building. Also, the building we're talking about, this is George Washington's home. The expression is George Washington slept here in many places around but he had just the one home. So does that ever give you pause when you're working on this one-of-a-kind building?
Every single second of every single day.
Yeah, sometimes you forget for like 5 minutes, and then you look at what you're doing, and like, oh, yeah, this is George Washington's house. Like, I need to, pay attention, basically.
It is, it's, for me, it's the honor of my career to work at a place of such significance. And it is, it's a heavy responsibility that we all take very seriously. And we're not starting from zero. There were literally 160 years worth of work and study that went on before we got there in order to help us start where we're starting. It's a great privilege to work at an organization that has kept an archive of everything they did to this house since they purchased it in the 1850s. Almost nothing is to chance in what we do, because we spend weeks doing research before we ever do the work. That's phase one. And then phase two, as Amy said, is we turn to the building and we proof that research against what we're seeing in the building, and then we kind of reverse engineer out of that.
Explain the idea of reverse engineer.
Well, you open up a space and you look at the timbers, and you can tell what timbers are from the 18th century based on the tools used to make them, the species that was used, but the nails that are holding something together. We read all that and we begin to form a biography of that part of the building, and that informs our work. So we think this went in first, this went in second, this was cut here, this was done like that. And if we have to take it apart, we do it exactly the opposite to get back to the most original part of the building. And then we rebuild from there in as much sympathy to that original material as possible.
Yeah, I'm curious also about the tools that you're using. Is it a kind of a mixture, combination of very traditional tools that would have been the same used in the 18th century, or some modern tools?
We use a combination of both. We do have a full modern mechanized shop on site, but for a lot of the end work, it's 100% hand tools. Before I came to Mount Vernon, I owned a business out west for over 20 years, and about 9 years into my business, I sold all my power tools and only went with hand tools to build historic windows and doors. And that's actually how I came to be at Mount Vernon. And so, as a tradesperson, when you're starting out, you will start to accumulate tools. You slowly learn how to use the tools, and you keep that kit with you as you go. And so we do a combination of, some rough milling with power tools potentially, and then all of the surfacing, all of the joinery is done with hand tools.
And we kind of have a mixed philosophy. So anything that is visible to the public, anything that will be seen, has to be done with 18th century tools that leave 18th century type marks behind, right? It has to look like it's 1799. Anything inside the walls, like if we're replacing a section of a stud, and it's never going to be seen again unless we open the walls up again, then we're going to just use a circular saw, because we want to leave the information behind that we were there, that we did this work. Now, I'm an architectural historian. You heard me say about how I read this tool mark and that tool mark and this nail and that nail. I'm able to make those judgments because I know what they used. And in the future architectural historians will know what we had available to us, and they'll see the tools that we used and the marks left behind, and they won't be fooled by what we did. So anything not visible is done in a modern way. Anything visible is done in the 18th century way.
Yeah. Now, Martin, I saw you nodding your head in agreement while Amy was talking. So would you like to talk about the tools you use and maybe the different types of pleasure you maybe derived from working with an 18th century tool rather than a 21st century tool?
For me, I'm a student at ACBA, rising senior
American
right now.
College of the Building Arts, and they have the tent. It's in Charleston, South Carolina, the tent to the west there.
And our first semester of freshman year, we only use hand tools. So we get that practice of using hand tools. So when I go to a place like Mount Vernon, I'm not left in the dust where I only know how to use modern day machinery. I know how to use the traditional tools that they would have used. So every single day I'm going to grab my hand plane, my chisels, my even stones to sharpen all that stuff, because a dull tool is an unsafe tool. But it's just a pleasurable experience to be able to use your tools that you take care of, that you use every day. They fit your hand learns how to use them, and different techniques to get different effects. It's the best part about this job, is being able to use a hunk of metal and produce a piece of art,
Yeah. Allison, do you have any perspectives on the tools you're using as part of your woodworking?
Yeah, kind of in a similar vein. I think using the historic hand tools definitely shows you and gives you an appreciation for the people that came before you. You can see the labor that was put into a house. You can also really put in perspective like how inexperienced you are and how inefficient you are, because the people before you, like, this is all they had. They had to learn how to do it quickly, and like we'll never probably match their pace and their ability to do that work. And then the other side of that is you appreciate your power tools to get you part of the way there and, like, you know, save you some sweat and some agony. But then overall, it's just, you know, gotta love the tool marks and being able to do things by hand.
So I wanted to maybe come back to the theme of this program, next generation artisans. Maybe talk about the philosophy at George Washington's Mount Vernon about training this next generation of artisans? Who would like to address that? Amy? See.
Well, like I said, training the next generation is a very important part of myself and for the preservation department. And it's great that we have this affiliation with American College of the Building Arts, and we're able to pass these on and see, kind of the development of these students as they, spend 6 to 10 weeks with us. And I don't know if, Martin, were you prepared for the amount of hand tool use that we do?
I knew what I was expecting.
Okay.
I knew what I was getting into.
Okay. Sometimes, we do use a lot of hand tools, and if you're not ready for that, it can be a bit of a learning curve.
How many out of 7 carpenters are ACBA? 4 out of 8. Half of our carpenters went to the American College of the Building Arts, and 3 of those were interns at Mount Vernon and came back to work for us.
Yeah.
Well, I have more questions, but I don't want to monopolize the questions for our people who are talking about preserving George Washington's Mount Vernon for future generations. Are there any questions from the audience? We have a microphone. Since we're recording these sessions, it would be great if you could use that microphone behind you. Please.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I know that there's debate about whether there are too many historic house museums, and this one in particular has the stature of having been our first president's home, and I keep hearing it, you all refer to it as George Washington's Mount Vernon. I think one of the fascinating aspects of historic house museums, though, is their ability to show so much more than the one person who's associated with it. It shows domestic life, which women were historically relegated to. It shows family life. It shows servants and slaves. It shows how it was built. It shows how the person who lived there interacted with animals and the land, and how it changed over generations. And I'm just curious if you found anything in your work that tells a new story, like we read about with Monticello finding Sally Hemings's room. Have you found anything like that at Mount Vernon that really changes what you can tell in the story to visitors?
Well, sure. Mount Vernon was a community of just under 350 people when Washington died, and 317 of them were enslaved. Lived there and worked there against their will. They're the ones who built it. Theirs is the handiwork that we replicate on a daily basis, and they're the ones whose sweat and toil we appreciate because we see the skill that they put into it. For this particular project, we made a really significant discovery in the research that we did. Part of this will be because we're working on the lowest level of the framing, just above the cellar. We did a lot of investigation in the cellar, and we were able to determine through documentary research that the south room of the cellar was referred to as the kitchen or the servants' hall, and it was really the center of enslaved service for the house. But what was exciting to discover was that there were references to Frank's room in the cellar, and Frank was frankly the enslaved butler. And there were also unrelated references to the fact that Lucy the cook lived, it had been transcribed years and years ago as above the kitchen, but it actually said in the kitchen. And as it turns out, there was a room, or 2 rooms, off the kitchen in which we have now believe that Frank and his wife, Lucy the cook, lived with their 3 children. There's another letter in which Washington, as I like to call it, his cranky old man letter, he says, those kids should not be playing on the lawn. And he's talking about the enslaved children at Mount Vernon. And by then he corrects himself and says, except for those of Frank and Lucy. And they get a pass because they live in the cellar of the house with their parents. And this is the first time we've been able to actually establish that an enslaved family lived in the house with the Washingtons. We believe before this point that everybody lived out on the big brick slave quarter on the north lane of the house. So this was a very significant discovery that we made as part of our preservation effort. You guys?
And we will be restoring that section of the house to its appearance from the 18th century, including those 2 rooms.
And it will be the focus of the cellar interpretation. Its service is the focus of the cellar. Allison?
Yeah, I mean, I think in that same vein, it gives us a different idea of what we're seeing in the cellar as well, because I remember when we were looking at the plasterwork, because we're preparing to replaster that area in the cellar for interpretation, and we noticed that there were 2 layers of plaster, and typically you don't see that really ever, and so it's like, why was that there? Why was there 2 levels of plaster, your standard level that's on the underside of the framing work, and then one that's on the underside of the flooring as well? And then you realize, oh, George Washington's study is right above this room, so if he needs his quiet space and he is in that study all the time, he does not want to be hearing what's going on underneath and get distracted by conversation and whatever else is happening. So it gives you a different idea of that domestic life, right? And it's like, that's a factor that we wouldn't know. Something like sound, how it travels through the house, that's really important for their daily life.
Now, did Washington actually use the word kids playing on the lawn?
He says children.
Oh, okay. We have a question here. Yes.
Okay. 3 questions. What is a marriage mark? What is a Chiquita? And you're talking a great deal how you're trying to rebuild the George Washington's house in the way it was done in the 18th century. Are you doing the same with the slave quarters?
Marriage mark or carpenter mark is it's usually a Roman numeral that was placed upon the timbers before it was put into place. So the sequence of events for a timber frame is after it's hewn and sized, they lay it out to do the joinery on the ground. They do all the joinery and put it together on the ground, and then they mark each piece with numbers, and it's a numbering system. They take it all apart and then they bring it to the site and they put it back together. It's almost like a puzzle, and those numbers guide the people putting it back together so that no piece is missed or put in its wrong position. Chiquita? Whatever the heck that is.
Well,
It's a charchita, I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that is a gift terminology from some contractors we have that work at Mount Vernon. We work very closely with them because they undergo the process of stripping all the linseed, steaming all the linseed paint off of the outbuildings and off of the mansion in order for that to get repainted and preserved well. And so when we were showing them these notches that were made in the mansion siding to give you that mimicry of stone, they were like, "Oh, that's a charchita," and we're like, "What? What does that mean?" I think it translates to cockroach.
No, I think it's a type of pig.
Is it? Oh no, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
They're all native Spanish speakers,
Right,
so they
right.
didn't quite know what that thing was called in English.
Right.
And so they said charchito, which I think what we got was that's kind of like a thingummy in from their part of the Spanish speaking world. It's kind of like a whatchamacallit.
Right.
And so they started calling it the whatchamacallit.
And then we started calling it the same thing. So
whatchamacallit sounds
yeah,
but
exactly.
yeah. So it's kind of an inside carpentry team joke.
Yeah.
And then the third question
third part?
was.
What's the third one? We were starting the slave quarters.
Oh,
Yes,
right.
yeah.
Yes, I'll field that. Mount Vernon has acknowledged its slaveholding status. The first time was that when the ladies erected a memorial to the enslaved workers there in 1929. It's the first historic site that actually set up a memorial to those who were enslaved on that site. We reconstructed the main slave quarter in 1950 and have interpreted it as a slave quarter since then. We have reconstructed one of the outlying slave cabins as well. We are currently excavating one of the, Mount Vernon was originally 5 separate farms together. We're on the center farm, the dwelling farm, and the outer farms were production agriculture farms. So the life of one who was enslaved on the home farm was quite different from those who were enslaved on the outer farms, who were field laborers. So our archaeology team is actually now excavating the site of one of the satellite farms, the quarters. So we will be able to compare the life, because we've already excavated quarters on the dwelling farm. So we want to be able to compare the life conditions of those working out in the fields as to those who were working in the skilled trades, because they were all the people who kept house, the carpenters, the painters, things like that. And we will restore the Lee's quarters. And as I said, it will be the focus of our interpretation of the cellar. So it's a lot of, I know that Monticello and Montpelier have gotten a lot of press recently. Mount Vernon didn't get press because we had already been doing it for half a century. So it is a point of pride for us. And that's why I'm emphasizing it. We've been doing it a very, very long time. They're the people that live there. It's their story. It's their home. They lived there. They worked there. They died there. They loved there. They laughed there. They cried there. Just like the Washingtons did. It was everybody's home.
Are those outer farms all part of the current property, or?
No, they're all suburban development now.
Oh, okay.
This one just happened to fall on a large enough piece that had not been developed into suburban housing, a 6-acre parcel, and it just, by the grace of the universe, was not developed. And that's exactly where that slave quarters stood. And we have already identified 3 individual cabins where those folks lived and labored.
Any other questions from the audience for our panel here? Sir?
I just had one quick question. Why has it not been established?
Yeah, if you could use the mic, please.
No, sorry. Why has it not been established as a National Historic Preservation place?
Mount Vernon?
Yeah.
It is. It's on the National Register of Historic Properties. It's a National Historic Landmark. It's just not owned by the federal government. It is privately owned, and it will always be so.
And is there some reason why they don't get federal funding to keep up these?
Federal funding comes with strings, and our board does not want to accept the strings that come with accepting federal funding. And they have not needed to. They're very successful fundraisers.
Thank you.
Other questions? Well, that leads me to ask, so it's open to the public. Is it open every day of the year?
Yes.
Okay. Admission, there's admission charge.
$28 for an admission. You could become a member for just a little bit more, and then you get to come as many times as you want during the course of the year.
And how does the constant stream of visitors every day of the year kind of affect your work doing historic preservation?
Well,
Allison?
I think of it as a really helpful factor, because you can kind of get stuck in your daily tasks and put your head down and, just do your normal thing. But as soon as somebody comes by and they're like, oh, what are you doing? And you see their engagement and their interest in it, it really just brightens up your day and gives you a better perspective on what you're doing as well.
So while you're doing this work, visitors are not cordoned off necessarily. I mean, they're separated, but they can see what you're doing.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And
they have questions. They have tons of questions.
And it's fine for you to respond to them. You're not in some cocoon with headphones on, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think a lot of us welcome that as well. I mean, there's there's certain points, if we're using a chisel, we're not going to keep talking and chiseling our hand or anything, but being able to field questions, especially from you get some really young kids that want to know some things about what's going on, and you're like wow, I didn't expect that you would be that interested in what we're doing. And it's what is the saw doing? How does that work? Or are you George Washington? It's no, I'm not George Washington. But yeah, so I really enjoy that part of the job.
Yeah, Amy and Martin, do you have some stories of interaction with our visitors?
As a kid, my mom used to take me to Mount Vernon all the time,
Oh.
and I always looked at the building and looked at people working on it and loved seeing that kind of stuff, and getting that feeling of seeing, looking over your shoulder and seeing this little boy looking at what you're doing and just enthralled in you just working is such a great and wholesome experience for me, and fully completes that circle of my life now.
No, that's great. And so do you tell that little boy that I was you 15 years ago or so?
You can do this too.
Yeah. 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 Well, that's another question: is how do we excite the next generation to go into this field and learn the building trade? This came up in a conversation yesterday. Someone was saying that the building trades are not, the word they use, are not sexy, are not that appealing. You know, people would rather understand algorithms or, you know, work in social media. So what do you feel are ways in which we can attract more people into your line of work?
Well, I mean, that's a complex question, but a really good one. And I think taking advantage of things like social media these days, and just like, I think if you can showcase the whole process to somebody, and you can start like from the beginning where you're like, okay, I'm working with this like kind of intimidating, like this piece of wood, it's like intimidating. I have to like plane it down 1/4 of an inch by hand, and it has to like, you know, you have to like maintain your tool, and you have to like go through all these processes to get to like your final stage. If you can show that whole process, like how rewarding it is insane. And like being able to translate that to somebody, I think is really important. And I don't quite understand the whole like wanting to be part of the algorithms part. I think just because I was always like a very tactile kid, and I always wanted to like build things and create things. So when I went to college, I was like, I went for historic preservation, but I was like on the academic side of things, and I was like, you know, very antsy. I was like, I want to like do some stuff. I want to play around with things. And then we did some cemetery preservation, and we were like, you know, writing tombstones, and we were like transcribing things. And I was like, as soon as like you start touching these materials and you can engage with like the physical history, it's like it's a whole different experience.
I
Other
think
thoughts?
there are
Yeah,
people
Amy?
out there. I think, you know, tapping into those kids that are hand gifted. Having more schools like the American College of Building Arts, and kind of showing that, yeah, it's, you know, blue collar, but it's a great field. You're never without work. I started my business in 1996, and I never had a moment where I wasn't busy constantly. And so, you know, trying to get outreach, this is a great festival for outreach for young people, to kind of illustrate what's out there. If you don't want to go into the algorithms and the social media, or if you like working with your hands, there are fields out there that would love to have you. And those are the people that we want to find.
You know, I'll be a little more philosophical. I think we have to work on erasing our perceived divisions. Even today, you asked a question about the enslaved community because we were referred to as George Washington's Mount Vernon. The history of Mount Vernon is the history of George Washington, and of Sambo, who was a carpenter, and of Nat, who was a blacksmith, and of Caroline Branham, who was a housemaid, and of Martha Washington, who was a homemaker, and allowed Washington to do things he did. All those people allowed him to do what he did. The history of that place, the history of this place, the history of this country is a shared history. It doesn't matter where your people came from, what color their hair was, their eyes was, their skin was. They all contributed something to make this country that we live in today. And as long as we divide and say, well, this is slave history, this is white history, this is Hispanic history, this is that history, your history, her history, my history, then we're limiting the pool of people who care about what's important, the things that went into what makes this country important. We gotta get rid of all that. It's all of our history. Every one of these museums, take away the adjective. It's America's history, all of it. And to me, I think when we set ourselves into our little mindset, we undercut what makes this country great. And part of the preservation movement is having an appreciation of what individual Americans did, not just one person, two person, but all of us as a culture. We gotta get together, because that's what makes this country great, and I think that's what brings people into our history. Something good, bad, ugly, warts, the beautiful parts. It's all something we share. We all share responsibility for it. We all share acceptance of, and something that we all need to work together. So there's my little preaching about preservation and the history of America. Let's get together, people. I love you all.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. That's a very eloquent way, I think, almost to conclude, maybe in our final minute or so. I see you, Mount Vernon has its own tent. Can you tell us what's happening there and what people might be able to see later this afternoon?
We will be starting to do pit sawing over there. And we have also an array of tools that we use on a daily basis. And we have one of our pit saws set up for sharpening, because there's nothing more pleasing than a sharp tool.
So come on by and watch the pit sawing. It's really cool to see. So.
Yeah, but before they go off the stage, please a round of applause for Allison Brashears, Tom Reinhart, Amy McAuley, Martin Dougherty. Also like to thank our stage manager, Dave Clements, our audio engineer, Keith Stevens, our venue manager, Deb Rettenberg, and our ASL interpreter, Isabel, and our cart provider, Katie, by way of Zoom. So thank you and enjoy the rest of the day. Happy 4th of July. And coming up at 3 o'clock is Stories of Discovering a Passion for the Building Arts. So happening right here in 15 minutes.
Happy Independence